Hey super scientists, we're looking at evolution too, and we're going to talk about some different examples for the evidence of evolution. A lot of those are going to be related to anatomy, and anatomy is just looking at body structure. So for example, these arm bones, you can see how they are articulated, and they look very similar. They have similar bones and similar structure. So that is a reference to anatomy, the body structure. One example of evidence for evolution is the fossil record. So we know that fossils are the remains of once living organisms. And the fossil record is going to show us all the fossils that have been discovered so far on Earth. And one thing that we know from the fossil record is that the simplest organisms, like bacteria and invertebrates, those were the earliest organisms that lived. And today, the organisms that we find are more complex. So we go from unicellular to multicellular, and we go from bacteria and invertebrates invertebrates that are in the ocean like jellyfish and things like that, to the mammals and the birds and different reptiles and plants that we see today. So the oldest organisms represented in the fossil record are going to be more simple, and the ones that are more recent or current are more complex. Another piece of evidence for evolution is transitional fossils. So transitional fossils are going to show us a transition period. So it's going to be an intermediate stage between ancestors, the organisms that lived way long time ago, and descendants that live currently today. So one example I've shown you here is looking at whales, Pakicetus to Aedocetus, and you can look at the different skulls to see how things have changed. They all look very similar. They look whale-like, but there's a couple of different things that are different. So if you look at the teeth here, the teeth on this one, and then the absence of teeth. And if you look at the nostril placement, so the nostril being towards the front, the middle, and then kind of transitions to being more at the top of the skull. And so based on that different anatomy, that different body structure, that would allow for different things to take place, or for the whale to be able to do different things, such as in the case of the whale, being able to submerge most of its body underwater and still be able to breathe because it has this nostril on top of the skull. Another example is horses. So if we look at the evolution of horses, Equus, this is our modern day horse, and it's going to have one phalange and this hoof. But you can look at the evolution of this anatomy and see how horses have changed over time. So horses, actually the Hyracotherium and some of the other ancestors of horses used to have multiple toes. So this is an example showing you a 3-toed horse and a 4-toed horse. So the horses a long time ago used to have multiple toes that would distribute their weight. Whereas today, the horses that we're familiar with just have one hoof. Comparative anatomy. So comparative anatomy is doing what we were just looking at with the horses. It's looking at the different structures, but instead of it being looking at descendants and the ancestors, it's comparing the anatomy of modern day organisms. So comparing structures of organisms that live in a similar time. So anatomy, remember, is a reference to body structure. And through natural selection, the structures are going to be better adapted to the organism's environment. So, for example, with the horses that we were looking at, why did horses evolve to where they just have one toe right now? Maybe it had something to do with the ground, changes in the ground, or changes in the permafrost or the soil. So maybe that had something to do with it. So the structures that you see here, we have an arm articulation like we were looking at earlier on one of the slides. We have an arm articulation of a whale and a bat. So all of these have very similar structures. And this one is color-coded. So you can see that the different arm bones, like this is the humerus for the cat, humerus for a whale, humerus for a bat. So they all look similar. The length is a little bit different, the width is a little different, but as you get further down into the radius and ulna, into our phalanges, you can see that they all do look very similar, but they have changed, they're modified in some way to best meet the needs of that organism in that particular environment. And that's the same thing with the Galapagos finches that Charles Darwin studied. Those finches have different beak shapes, and that is to help them to eat whatever food was available to them in their particular environment in one of the islands in Galapagos. Vestigial structures are something that it's a weird kind of vocabulary word, vestigial. So there's something that may have been important in functioning as an organ in our ancestors, but today we don't really need it. It doesn't really serve any purpose. And one example of that is the appendix. So you may have heard of someone having their appendix removed or having appendicitis or something like that. So your appendix is kind of a little squiggly organ at the bottom of your large intestines. So it is part of the digestive system. But you can live without your appendix. So if your appendix gets inflamed, if it's infected, you can actually have that structure removed and you'll still be able to live. Another one that a lot of people hear about is wisdom teeth. Most of us probably have or will have your wisdom teeth extracted. So those are the teeth at the very back of your mouth. They are large molars. So these wisdom teeth may have served a purpose in helping our ancestors to consume food and to chew up meat or vegetation, but we can live without those particular structures. The butt bone, the coccyx, is another example. Embryology is one other piece of evidence for evolution, and embryology is looking at embryos. So embryos are unborn babies. So this is looking at this through like an ultrasound, like a pregnant mother may have an ultrasound to look at the baby to measure the size of the baby and that sort of thing. So in looking at different embryos, at the structure of different animals in their unborn babies, we're able to see similarities in those embryos. For example, we can see that there are gill slits on all of these organisms, and there's also a tail structure. And they all do look kind of similar in the shape of the head and the elongated body. So let's look at what these are. So this first one is a fish, and you can kind of see this is the tail. The next one, this is a reptile, so that would be like a lizard or a chameleon. This one is a bird, and this one is a human. So these structures are within these particular organisms because they may have functioned in our ancestors, but as you can see with some of these, like the gill slits in birds and humans, those gill slits are not present in babies when they are born. Adults do not have gills. Those gills are necessary for organisms to be able to live in water environments and to have the water kind of filtered through the gills. But those structures are not present in organisms today. So let's look at a couple different bears. You may be able to visualize some different types of bears. So I'm going to show you a few of them. So black bears, brown bears, polar bears. This is a cute little spectacled bear. So why do we have a bear here? This appears to be a mother. This is a blonde colored bear and two black bear cubs. So why do they have different colors if all of these are bears? But in this case particular, this would be parent and offspring. So how do they end up having different colors? Well, that's all due to genetics, right? So having different color variation is one way that organisms may be adapted to their environment. So for example, the polar bear is white to kind of blend in with that environment more, whereas grizzly bears, black bears may be more suited to their particular environment in living in the woods. Geographic distribution. So geographic distribution, geography just refers to the particular location. So there are certain fossils that have been found in environments that those particular organisms would not be able to live today. One example is the Glossopteris. So Glossopteris is a fern fossil. It's a type of plant. Glossopteris is a type of plant. And you can see in this picture that the Glossopteris fossils are found all through this bottom part. So this is actually Pangaea, and this is the southernmost part of Pangaea. So as these continents separated through continental drift, we ended up having these fossils that are now found in Antarctica. And we know about Antarctica that it's at the South Pole, it's covered with ice and snow, and it's not conducive to plants growing, especially tropical plants like the Glossopteris. So that one piece of evidence helps us to learn more about how Earth has changed in the geography and the plates, including the continents, have changed. So this is a little bit of a better picture of Glossopteris, just so you can see what this particular plant would have looked like. So it was a tree, and it's in tropical kind of environment, so it had these little spores and those pollen grains and things like that. So it's a very tropical plant that definitely would not live in Antarctica today. Another term is speciation. So what is speciation? Speciation is just where you have new species of organisms that evolve. So if you have something that takes place, like geographic separation of the continents, for example, you may have speciation occur. So in this picture, you've got some little foxes, and they're separated by this water. Well, what if that gets even further apart, and eventually those two species can't interbreed? Well, speciation will occur, and they will develop into two different species. So that is what has happened with the example of the finches we've talked about. That's what happened with a lot of canine organisms like wolves and dogs. So as things geographically separated and different species of organisms were isolated, speciation occurred, and so we have various species of particular types of organisms. Does evolution still continue today? Yeah, of course it does. So evolution is happening right under our noses. But more than that, humans actually have an impact on evolution. And humans have an impact on evolution through what is called artificial selection or selective breeding. And if you've ever heard of somebody having a purebred dog, or somebody that breeds cats, for example, or in this case, cows, that is all an example of how humans are impacting evolution. So this is showing you a Belgian blue cow. Belgian blue cows are huge, and they have been bred by humans to have specific traits, and those traits are being much larger and having a lot more musculature. So these cows have been selectively bred to have those particular traits. So that is humans influencing nature. Peppered moss, this is another example. So in the Industrial Revolution, a lot of black soot and smoke and pollutants were pumped into the air, and all that would eventually be deposited down towards the ground and would land on trees and things like that. So we have a peppered moth right here. They're traditionally white and black speckled color. So what happened with the trees is that these peppered moths, as the trees were getting coated in black soot, they ended up being very visible, and so birds could come by and eat them really easily because they were able to see them. So what happened to all the peppered moths that were very light in color? Well, they all got eaten, so they weren't able to pass down their genetic information. They were not able to reproduce. And so what you ended up having happen was that the peppered moths that were blacker in color, that were darker, were the ones that were able to survive. And so then as the air sort of started to clear and the air quality got better, the trees weren't being covered in as much soot. So what ended up sticking out now? The black peppered moths. And so they were more easily being able to be picked off by birds and eaten. So it has kind of gone back and forth throughout history with these particular peppered moths. Another example is antibiotic resistance, and we talked about this in our microbiology unit. So antibiotics are a chemical that's used to treat bacterial infections and diseases, and antibiotic resistance is where you have bacteria that have become super mutant bacteria. They are resistant to a particular antibiotic and will no longer be killed in the presence of that antibiotic. They can survive. And so that is an example of evolution that's occurring, and some of that is due to humans and the overuse of antibiotics. So normally the bacteria would die in the presence of the antibiotic, but with the resistant bacteria, the bacteria would end up surviving and then being able to produce more offspring and passing on that genetic material that allowed it to survive in the presence of the antibiotics. And MRSA, which is this nice picture here, is an example, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So that is one example of an antibiotic-resistant bacteria.